So reports are coming in now that the Kerch Bridge was hit somewhere between 3 and 4 hours ago. It looks like there's some pretty significant damage to the roadway. Getting some different reports coming in as the sun's starting to come up in Ukraine right now, but the word has it there is damage to the roadway. The rail may still be intact, but all traffic on the road, all traffic on the rail, as well as the ferry system has been stopped between Russia and occupied Crimea. Here's another angle of the damage that was done to the Kerch Bridge. Apparently, it was a missile strike. Again, not 100% sure on all of the logistics, all of the tactics used here as this is just kind of coming in. What we do know is that the bridge has been pretty significantly damaged in this section here. A picture shot from afar of the bridge. You can see the span that was hit. The lights are out on it. Again, not sure exactly where this is on the bridge. We do know it is over the water, and it is enough damage that all traffic has stopped in and out of the Kerch Bridge region, whether you're coming from Russia or Crimea. So here we have southern Ukraine, Crimea right here, Russia's over here. The Kerch Bridge sits right here. It connects Russia to Crimea. This potentially is significant in two ways. The first way, and the less, significant of the two, is the geostrategic and geopolitical implications for Putin. This bridge was touted as a big marker, a big feather in his cap in his policy to reunite Crimea with the Russian mainland. And he built this bridge here. But if that's taken out, his people are going to start to once again question his ability to protect them. For years now, since 2014, Putin has touted Crimea as a part of Russia. They're Russian people, they say. This is where the Russians vacation. If the Russian people in Crimea can't get basic supplies because the ground line of communication or the supply line that runs across that bridge is destroyed, then the people in Russia are really going to start questioning Putin's ability to keep them safe, especially when you're seeing attacks into Russia, including attacks into Moscow, when you're seeing the assassination of submarine commanders in Russia. The Russians have said that the rail line seems to be still operable, but trains are not running right now. The puppet government of Crimea, as well as the Russians, have said that they have enough supplies on hand, including energy, food, etc., to continue to service the Crimean Peninsula without any kind of interruption. The question I have is can they service the Crimean Peninsula while still supporting the front line, which this bridge was a ground line of communication for logistics to split and support the front line and keep the supplies of everything from MREs to ammunition to regenerating forces and refitting them to retrograding and repairing equipment, getting new equipment to the front line, etc. If this ground line of communication or this supply line is destroyed, it leaves one other, and it's a lot more dangerous for the Russians. It is a southern route that runs through a lot of targetable areas. If Ukraine can target the Kerch Bridge, they're going to be able to find ways to target the E58 highway that runs through here. And this highway it'll have to bear the burden. This singular highway will have to bear the burden of trying to resupply the entire front line by itself via ground. Well, via ground this way too, but that makes it more complicated for the Russians. It makes it more dangerous for the Russians. From a ammunition standpoint, we already know that in this region right here, in the Kherson region, the Ukrainians are firing 2.5 times more rounds than the Russians are. This is because of that depot that was destroyed a few weeks ago, not being able to get enough rounds to the front line. So what we're seeing now is the Ukrainians somewhat weakening the Russians in the Kherson region, and I'll zoom in here. They've established a bridgehead. We've seen their riverines, which is like river marines, basically. Riverines conducting island captures where they've taken islands from the Russians in this region and established a bridgehead, a pretty significant bridgehead, to start conducting operations into the occupied portions of Ukraine here. If they can liberate enough of this portion, and by limiting the supplies, they have a real chance of being able to take this highway, which will cut off this entire region here from Russia's ability to resupply it. If I zoom out on this, that includes Crimea. Like I said, if they can take this region right here because they have made it logistically untenable for the Russians to stay here, Crimea is in dire straits for Russia. And this very similar thing happened in Kherson. The Ukrainians made it logistically impossible to keep Kherson supplied, and the Russians flat out just left. They picked up and left because they could not maintain operations there. And we may be seeing a similar situation here if the Ukrainians can make this whole line right here untenable for them to continue to occupy, the Russians to continue to occupy, because there's no logistics support coming out of Crimea, and that logistics support has to come from here and then kind of spoke out to get to where it needs to be. This could be the breakthrough region, or this potentially could be the scenario that gets Ukraine into a better position to cut off Crimea. Now, responses from Putin. I'm not sure. He called his Ministry of Defense to an emergency meeting along with much of his staff, his oligarchs, etc. I can tell you that the one thing that's still on the negotiating table is the grain deal. I'm not going to say that grain deal is dead, but if there's anything that is going to take a hit for the Kerch Bridge being potentially destroyed, it is the grain deal. He will use that, saying that the West supplied Ukraine with the weaponry needed to conduct an attack on the Kerch Bridge. And I don't know where this attack came from. We don't know if it came from land, if it came from sea. There have been reports that potentially there was a naval incursion and that fired missiles on the bridge, but I don't know. We're just getting some initial information. We'll get more over the next 24 hours, but this is kind of what we're looking at when it comes to the total outcome. And I think Putin will respond with potentially stopping the grain deal, which would hurt the prospects for the West, but also hurt the prospects for Russia, because they're already kind of in deep water with other countries. They were promised to support or supply aircraft to Iran, and they're not doing it, and because they just don't have it, and they're struggling to make it. So this is very strategically advantageous for Ukraine to take this bridge out. And the fact that they may have done it at least to get the road destroyed, that would cut 20% of the logistics coming from Russia through Crimea. If they took out the remaining 80%, which is rail logistics, and this bridge is completely damaged and not unrepairable for at least a few weeks or months, that may be enough to tip the balance in favor of Ukraine to potentially sweep in and retake Crimea and make this an untenable war at this point for Russia to continue fighting.